Next up, we are talking about a very handy tool which comes pre-installed in CakePHP, the Debug Kit. If we're looking into our CakePHP installation, into the applications PHP, we can see inside the bootstrap method that we have here a check for our debug mode, and if our debug mode is enabled, we add the plugin Debug Kit. Now you may ask, what does this Debug Kit plugin do? Well, in all the previous videos till now, this Debug Kit was hidden in plain sight in that regard, because at the bottom right you see a little CakePHP icon which you can click. And when you click on that icon, you can see that the whole toolbar opens with all kinds of tabs, which we are now going to go through each, so you can see what each tab can do. First of all, let's go into the cache tab. The cache tab gives you an overview of all the pre-configured and available cache engines. So by default, CakePHP comes with a default cache engine, and also internal engines which CakePHP uses for the core, for model caching, and for route caching. These engines sort of are just subsections inside of your cache, which you can clear separately and can use separately, as you may have already guessed. Then the next section here is the cache usage overview. So you can also see all the available engines inside the table. But now you can also see, did the current request handle some sort of caching inside of that engine? So the default engine had one hit here, and no misses, and no data set, and no data deleted inside that cache engine, and also for all the other engines. So yeah, that's basically it for this table, but we will see a little bit later what we can also do here. And the last section here is the cache logs section, where you can get more detailed information on what specific cache key was requested from that specific cache engine. So as you can see here, the Cake model cache engine requested a cache key, which is called Debug Kit requests, and it returned in 0.00005 milliseconds now on my local machine, of course. But now, if we clear all these caches and we reload the page and reopen that cache tab, we now see, okay, of course, now we cleared all the caches. We don't get any hits anymore, but we get, and we also get all the misses. In that regard, it's basically the same, mostly the same information. But we also see that now these entries have already been set now in these engines, and again separate more detailed information in the log table to see that setting the default meta fields or default blog posts cache keys takes that amount of seconds. So if you want to debug any cache related performance issues. But yeah, that's basically it for the cache tab. Now let's continue with the deprecations. And as you may see here, I have intentionally added one deprecation into our app controller blog post controller, because by default CakePHP shouldn't show you any deprecations if you haven't installed any more plugins or added custom code into your application. But yeah, if we just read through that rather quickly, the static method path in the app namespace is deprecated for class paths. Use Cake Core app class path or Cake Core plugin class path instead. And then it also tells you exactly the path to your file. So we now see here that the blog post controller is the main culprit in line 52. And if we just go into our code and we go into our blog post controller in line 52, we can see here, yeah, I have just added that basically deprecated usage of app path, the app path method, but the app path method itself is still not deprecated because it has other usages as well. It's just that the class type is deprecated in CakePHP. And this is what is being shown here as well. You can of course have deprecations in your plugins as well, either in your private plugins or in your vendor external plugins. These will also be inside extra sections here in the deprecations panel, so you can more easily find where these deprecations are coming from. But yeah, that's basically it for the deprecations panel. Then let's get on to the environment. The environment itself is pretty, well, let's say self-explanatory and pretty boring in that regard, that it's just an overview of all, the application constants, the CakePHP constants, the ini environment and the general PHP environment. Let's say the most important part of the PHP environment, because it's rather huge by default. Just so you can easily check all these variables and environment stuff if you need a quick overview and need to check it if you don't want to go into your terminal or somewhere else when you don't have direct access to the more detailed information. But yeah, that's basically it for the environment tab. Then let's go on to the history tab. And the history tab, as you can see here, always keeps the last 10 requests in here, and you can click on each request to update the whole debug toolkit and the whole debug toolbar with all the necessary information. So if we, example, go here into the blog posts endpoint or blog post request here, we see we don't have any deprecations here anymore, and we see there have only been 2 cache hits. If we just stick to the panels we have already seen, and that's, let's say that's the basic information here right now. But as you also see here, this history panel also fetches AJAX calls in that regard, that its XML HTTP requests are being automatically fetched by Debug Kit. What does this mean? Well, by default, the 1xhr value here is not present, because when we reload the page, we see 0xhr, and then after a few seconds it displays that an XML HTTP request has been executed. And this is also visible inside our application, so we can see something dynamically has happened inside our application on this current website. But yeah, let's just continue now with the include tab, because this is also rather simple in that regard, that it shows you the included paths for here now the peer package, which is a custom one on my installation. But you can also see the included files grouped by all the let's say categories or types of files which will be included in this request. So we can see here this behavior was loaded from CakePHP core, or these controller and component files were loaded from CakePHP core. If you just want to have an overview of which files are being loaded in which request, you can go into this section and see what is actually being used in the current request. But yeah, then let's go forward into the log tab. The log tab here currently has nothing because I have pre-selected the XHR request. But if we go back to our default request, which is always the most top entry in the history tab, we can see that we now have log messages, and in that regard we also again see the notice message for our deprecation here with much more detailed information of the whole stack trace. So if you find some deprecations in your app, you can also maybe try the log tab. But also we can see other log messages here which are being executed and added to the log in the current request. So now if we go back to the source code, we can see here we have our log info method, which just says this is a custom log info message to just showcase this here right now. We can also see that this is also being visible here in the front end via the Debug Kit. Next up, the mail tab is a little bit more complicated in that regard, that we have to set up a whole CakePHP mailer and all the SMTP and mail stuff in general, so I won't go into any further detail because we will maybe have a future video talking about mailing in general and all the mail templating stuff. Next up, the packages tab shows you all the currently installed packages as well as their version, so you don't have to fiddle around with Composer if you just want to check, okay, currently CakePHP 4.4.2 is installed, maybe there's a new version coming out or has already been coming out. You can basically check that quickly, but of course other than that you can also just click check for updates at the top left, and this will execute an extra check because as you see here, CakePHP 4.4.3 has already been released as of the making of this video, and of course other sub dependencies have also been updated, but these include all the sub dependencies and all the sub packages. If you just want to check your direct dependencies, you can just check that checkbox, and now you see, okay, it's basically just Bake and CakePHP which need to be updated, and everything else is below and are the sub dependencies. But that's basically the packages tab. Next up, let's go to the request tab. The request tab contains all the data which are, well, directly related to the request in that regard, that we see the current route object which is used. So this is basically the route which is present inside our config routes.php. If we look into into our fallbacks, it's basically this controller action connect method here, and you can get more information about your current route via this object. We can see our current CSRF token and all the other stuff associated to the attributes of the current request. The post data here as well is displayed if the current request has any. Well, we have to do some post requests to do that. Well, I edited the current, if we go back, this is the category edit method. So if you go into our source controller categories edit, I disabled the redirect because of course when we redirect after a category has been saved, then the post data is not present anymore inside our current request. So I just disabled the redirect. That's also the reason why we have the category has been saved and the category could not have been saved, because both flash messages are being output here at the same time. But if we now look into our request tab, we now see, okay, our post data contains name and the blog posts as we have discussed previously, which are set inside our template forms. The query string in that regard is also pretty self-explanatory, that if we just say my key equals YouTube, and have to be careful with the macOS. Query string my key YouTube is also now present. So if you, for example, have such a huge query string inside your URL, you can get a better overview of what you currently have present inside your query string. Other than that, the cookies are also separated here to see which cookies have been sent by the client, and again the short abbreviation for the currently matched route, which is still basically the same as we've seen before in the dash route object. Yeah, that's basically it for the request tab. Let's continue with the routes tab. The routes tab is pretty self-explanatory in that regard, that it displays all the routes which are possible in CakePHP to take. So if we see here, okay, the /pages/star, so in the end, no matter what you type at the end, will get routed to the pages controller inside the display action. And yeah, the plugin is just null, so that it doesn't try to load the pages controller from inside another plugin. And yeah, the route can be accessed via this name as well if you need to. But if you have other maybe vendor plugins or your own plugins installed, routes from these plugins will be put inside their own sections in that regard, that you can enable and disable these routes via these buttons at the top. So if you see here now, I disabled the app routes but enabled the Debug Kit routes, and these are all the routes the Debug Kit uses to do basically all its functionality. But yeah, and also as you see here, the currently active route in that regard, the currently used route, is also highlighted in this darker or in this bluish color. So you can also see that, well, we are currently in categories edit 1. This means, of course, we are inside this route, and therefore this is the currently active route. Next up, the session is, well, rather self-explanatory as well. If we have some sort of session values which we set inside our code, which we can of course do via the request object. So we can say this get request get session right, and then say my session key is my session value. But let's just write this to YouTube so that we can see that this changes. We can see now that the session key has changed for this session, and therefore, yeah, you can basically see what is currently in session for that given request. Next up, the SQL log is also pretty self-explanatory in that regards, that it's showing you a pretty nice overview of all the SQL queries which have been executed in the current request. So yeah, basically how many rows have been output out of this query. Well, okay, here the limit one is pretty self-explanatory, but if you have, let's say, a huge query with multiple subselects, this can get pretty messy, and you just need to know how many rows and how long this query took. You can use this view to see and to get a quick overview of what is happening with your queries. And next up, the timer is in that regard pretty nice performance performance tool to see which parts of your application took how long before the request has been sent back to the before the response has been sent back to the client. So in that regard, we can see, okay, the memory consumption. If you maybe have some sort of memory problem, you can see which part of the CakePHP application takes how much memory to load and the differences in between these stages. And also, yeah, the CakePHP has multiple events, like the controller initialize, the controller startup, view render, and yeah, as you see here, the controller action takes basically the major part of the whole requests processing, and the other major part is just the core processing, which is derived from the $server super global variable, which we get from PHP. But yeah, and the last tab is the variables tab, which can also be quite handy in that regard if you don't have if you don't want to var dump or dd or whichever debugging variable output method you desire. You can use this tab to see which variables are present inside the current template and what these variables, or in this regard now entities, have for properties or values present inside. One little note, of course, is what is stated here at the top. By default, CakePHP only shows 5 levels of nested data. If you want to override that, you need to basically set that config key, but we will get to that a little bit later. You can also sort these variables. If you have, for example, like 50 variables inside your template, you can maybe find your variables a little bit quicker. And validation errors inside your entities are also separated here, but you can also get the errors inside that entity as well, because it's basically also just a property inside that entity. But that's, let's just say, the general overview of the whole debug kit. One last thing I want to mention here is that depending on your current setup, so here we are using localhost, so here we don't have to adjust anything more, but if you, for example, use some custom top-level domain for your local setup, you may have to set the safe top-level domain inside your configuration, so that not only dev, local, example, and localhost are accepted by Debug Kit to load the Debug Kit, but also your custom top-level domain. So let's just say it's, example given, youtube.cc. You will have to configure this with the cc domain, so that CakePHP, the Debug Kit, loads with your custom top-level domain. And the other thing is, just as we've mentioned before, the variables panel max depth. You just have to increase the max depth here if you so desire, if you have such larger nested data inside your template. But please be warned, increasing the max depth level can lead to an out of memory error, and then you have to figure it out yourself how you can debug your huge template variables. But that's basically it for showcasing the whole Debug Kit toolbar and all the functionality which you can use and leverage inside your development workflow. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one.